It's September 9th, 2021. We thank you all for being here with us this morning. Don't know what it looks like in your part of the world, but here on the Northern Neck, we've got a little bit of gray skies and rain. So it's a good morning to be inside learning with everybody else. This morning, we're joined by Dr. Michael Flessner, our Extension Weed Science Specialist. This morning, Michael's going to be talking with us about his thoughts and opinions on management of weeds in pastures. So annual perennial weed species can always be an issue when raising pasture, when raising hay. So Michael's going to speak with us about that. Here in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to get started. But before we do that, just going to cover a few things. As always, this program is being recorded. If you'd like to go back and take a look at it at a later date or share it with someone else, you can find it on our VCE AG Today Facebook page, as well as on our YouTube channel. This program, as well as all the previously recorded programs, are available there for your viewing. Also, when we get started, we're going to ask that you mute your microphone and keep it muted until the end of the presentation, at which point we're going to open it up for questions. If you do have a question throughout the presentation, if you'd like, you can go ahead and just put it down there in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will address those questions at the end of the presentation when we do open it up for questions. So at this point, Michael, I'm gonna ask that you go ahead and share your screen, and I'll turn the host over to you.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We've got a little bit of rain in Blacksburg here this morning too. It's kind of nice. It's been really great weather. Feels like fall's here. We've got football back, and yeah, so things are good. I hope it's the same in your area. Yeah, so I'll jump in right here with the updates for pasture weed control. Usually this is pretty short and sweet, where there's just not a whole lot of new things going on in pasture weed control. But last couple of years, we've probably had as much going on in pastures as we've had in some of our row crops. And so one of those things is Duracore herbicide. Duracore's been on the market for a little over a year now, and so we're getting more experience out there in big acres and commercial usage with it. Duracore is really similar to Graze On Next. They both contain aminopyrrolid, so these are herbicides that do a lot of good heavy lifting on some of our tough to control perennial weeds. The difference between the two is really that Graze On Next was aminopyrrolid plus 2,4-D. Duracore drops the 2,4-D and puts in fluoroperoxyphene benzyl, which is a new active for us in the pasture and forage market. It's an auxin herbicide, so just like 2,4-D, dicamba, aminopyrrolid, it is a growth regulator type herbicide, and it's been in the market in rice for a number of years now. So what Duracore does different than Graze On Next is just really some minor improvements. If you ever try to mix it with UAN, there's a picture down there in the bottom. You see a little bit of precipitates coming out of solution. And so Graze On Next did not mix well with UAN, but if you want to do that with Duracore, that's a good option. They both have a very good weed control. These products make people like me look like I know what I'm talking about when I recommend them, because generally they're going to result in pretty good weed control if we get them on at the right time. Duracore picks up just a couple extra weeds that Graze On Next doesn't. Otherwise, they're very similar. So those are like the plantains and things in the carrot family. So poison hemlock or wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. Both of these herbicides, we'll talk about a little bit more about dry fertilizer impregnation, but that's becoming a more popular option for applying these. They both contain aminopyrrolids, so treating it with moving hay or residues off farm is prohibited with these, because that aminopyrrolid will stick around in those residues. They can pass through the cow, and we've had a few issues where it ends up in compost used in somebody's tomato garden, and then it kind of renders that garden useless for a couple of years, unfortunately. So got to make sure we keep these in permanent grass pastures and hay fields where they're intended to be used. Both are very safe to grasses, but both will kill your clovers. But so that's Duracore. I've had some feedback. The rate range on it's 12 to 20 fluid ounces, and some of the co-ops have not liked the 12 ounces as much as 16 ounces. At the 12 ounce rate, it just leaves a little bit, I guess, on the table. And so a 16 ounce rate is a little bit better and more comparable to like the 2 pints graze on necks there. So that's kind of where we settled out with the rate range. All right, so that's Duracore. Moving on to something, when we've had that on the market, moving on to something kind of really timely here is Perilla Mint. So Perilla Mint is a weed in the mint family that I usually get a lot of questions about this time of year, August and then early September. It's a weed that comes on late, and it is a poisonous weed. And so it kind of has this niche of coming up during the summer slump of our cool season grasses. And then when we get these dog days of summer, we don't have a lot of rain, there's not a lot of forage out there, an animal might go nibble on it, and it can be deadly poisonous. We've had some losses of cattle in Virginia over the last few years on it. Generally, animals will not touch this weed as long as there's some other forage out there. So if you have a greener pasture or some other, the ones that's not grazed down too much, or providing hay is a way to help alleviate the risk of cattle consuming this weed. We're really past where management as far as killing it with a herbicide is easily done. Ideally, we treat for this in June or July. Graze on necks is a little bit better than 2,4-D plus dicamba, but if you can get on it early, the 2,4-D dicamba will work on it. But right now it's probably flowering. And so after treatment with a herbicide after flowering is kind of questionable. You'll probably inhibit some seed production, but you're not going to kill the weed. So you'll have this kind of carcass out there. So you might need to mow that off anyway, because you don't really want a carcass out there that an animal might get into. But hopefully with this cooler weather we've had and some rain, pastures are greening up, and so there's other forage out there now. So mowing is an option here to just kind of knock it off and get rid of it, especially after flowering. I don't think it's going to come back after that time, but you also want to be careful not to spread seed around with the mower there. But so that's Perilla Mint. The other weed I thought would be good to specifically mention is sweet vernal grass. And so this was giving it a blue ribbon here, as far as this was the weed of the year for us, I think, in pastures and hayfields. It was, you see a seed head early in the year, late April to early June, that looks kind of like a foxtail seed head, but you can smell if you ever mowed it, the sweet vernal grass has that name because it has this kind of sweet aroma to it. And this was in every pasture and hayfield and ditch and field edge, I think, from one corner of the Commonwealth to the other this year. So it really kind of spoils that first cutting of hay in a lot of cases. It can be mildly toxic, so it contains dicumarols, which are blood thinners. I don't think it's deadly toxic, because if it was, we'd have a lot more dead animals across the state. We just haven't had that. But it is something to be aware of with this weed is that if you're putting up hay that has this in it, and it has a lot of it in it, and you're going to feed that out over a long time, you might see some issues with it in terms of a feed source. It's technically a short-lived perennial, which limits some of our management options. And so that means it's probably a lot of it's coming up from seed every year, but it might be over, I guess in this case, kind of over summering from year to the next. So probably only like a 2 to 3 year lifespan on it. When we talk about management, we're trying to control a grass in a grass, and we just don't have herbicides labeled for that in our pastures and hay fields. And so there's really no herbicide options. It doesn't get tall enough to where we can try to use the wiper bar or weed wiper trick with it with glyphosate. And it's just too many patches out there to think about spot treating it, really. So one option would be to try to renovate. So if you have a field that's worthwhile, that's kind of out of control, and you want to go to something like alfalfa, right, where we have options for grass control in that, that would work. But of course, that's only going to be a few acres. What I'd like to think would really help is sort of optimizing our pasture and hayfield management to try to really get some competition with this weed, because since it is coming up from an annual, if we can get those perennial fescues and orchard grasses really going, we should be able to help choke out this weed to a large extent. And so that's kind of where I'm going with, fall is actually a great time to be applying fertilizer to the pasture to help thicken it up. And so I threw, if you can see on the screen, or if not on the phone, I'll talk to these, but I thought I'd throw in a couple slides from some work that Dr. Kevin Bradley's done over in Missouri. And of course, Missouri soils aren't the same as Virginia soils, but I think it was kind of eye-opening to see some of the data that they found on this the survey. So they went across the state and surveyed 46 pastures, and of those 46 pastures, and they took soil samples, and then around each soil sample, they documented what weeds were there kind of throughout the year, and then they're able to correlate, the number and abundance of weeds to how the soil tested out, right? It had a good pH, it had a good fertility, those kinds of things. And what they found was that most of their soils, 80% were low or very low in phosphorus, and about a third were very low in potassium, or low or very low. And their average soil pH was a little bit low, 5.8. We'd rather be kind of 6.5 for an ideal pH. And so what that meant for weed control is basically that where they went up 1 unit in soil pH, they had about 4,000 fewer weeds per acre. And then a 1 part per million unit increase in P and K, which maybe somebody can do the back of the envelope math there, but I think that's about a pound per acre of fertilizer, corresponded to 61 and 12 fewer weeds per acre respectively. So having that soil, taking the soil test and following those recommendations is important to help minimize the weeds. And of course, we know it's going to help grow more grass and be more competitive too. So when we're talking about sweet vernal grass, I think trying to thicken things up this fall is a good time to maybe think about putting out your fertilizer. There's also some fall weed control opportunities coming up. It's kind of still feels like summertime a little bit. I know we're just after Labor Day here, maybe the unofficial end of summer. But there's some opportunities coming up here that maybe we're not thinking about. A lot of times, we see these seas of yellow in the spring from mustards or buttercups or those types of weeds. And the fall is a good time to do something about those weeds, but we don't think about it till the spring. So there's some opportunities here for things like buttercups, thistles, plantains, wild turnip or wild radish, even poison hemlock, and a number of other these cool season weeds that are coming out of the ground right now. But we're not quite to where we'd want to apply yet. So kind of how to do this is to scout the fields in mid-October or maybe early October here, and kind of rank your fields in terms of priority, right? We may not have time or weather or whatever resources to get to all those fields, but if you want to prioritize the fields of which ones are worse and put the resources towards that, it's always a good option. And then we got to watch the weather. As temperatures cool off, our herbicides start to lose their effectiveness because the weeds and the plants aren't actively growing as much. And so what we really need is a minimum of 3 days of about 60 degrees for a high and above freezing at night. So if you think about once we get into kind of Halloween to Thanksgiving era or that period, sometimes that can be hard to find. Sometimes it's pretty easy to find. But that's kind of the minimum. If you get more than that, that's better. And then you can actually come out. So I got a lot of this from Dr. Neil Rhodes at University of Tennessee. He was recommending 2,4-D ester at 3 pints per acre. I'm not a huge fan of 2,4-D by itself in pastures, but you can get away with something that's a little less persistent, right? Move away from the graze on next, and that would allow you to come back with some clovers at frost seeding in the spring if you want to. Whereas if you wait till the spring for weed management, you can't put those herbicides out after you've frost seeded your clover. But so if you get the weather right, rain free and some warm temperatures, and you can apply something like 2,4-D at 3 pints or maybe a 2,4-D plus dicamba, get good spray coverage. And I kind of think, early October to mid-December or sort of the Halloween to Thanksgiving is somewhat easier for me to remember. I mentioned a couple reasons of why the fall, but we do have these young actively growing weeds that seem to be easier to kill at that time versus they might still be young and actively growing in the spring after the winter, but that winter seems to harden them off and they're not as susceptible to herbicides at that time. Depending on your operation, you might have more time. You think about compared to spring, if you're calving or getting ready for row cropping and those kinds of things, there might be more time in the fall. There's also fewer sensitive crops out there in the landscape, or at least they're kind of done for the year. compared to the spring. If if you get out there late spring and into May, sometimes there's some sensitive crops out there in the landscape. And then I mentioned planting the legumes or clovers in the spring. If you put out the herbicide in the fall, something that's not persistent, so as long as it pretty much doesn't contain aminopyrrolid in terms of our pasture herbicides, you're good to plant legumes in the spring. So there's some opportunities there to think about. Certainly, if you've only have budget for, one herbicide every 2 to 3 years in a pasture, which is kind of typical, maybe the fall timing is a good time for you. That's where your most limiting weed control problems are, but it might be something, in the summer too. So those are all things to think about. All right, so moving kind of from, near future opportunities to maybe next year opportunities. I got a couple more points I wanted to mention. One is Proclova. So Proclova is a herbicide from Cooperative that's not currently on the market, but it is anticipated for registration in early 2022 now. And that's been delayed about a year, I assume due to COVID, like a lot of things. But this is a herbicide that should preserve white clover, as well as annual lespedeza, but of course, white clover is the big selling feature there. And so we've been doing some research with that for a couple, 3 years now. I wanted to share some of that with you this morning. So one of the things we evaluated is just what weeds it's going to control. And we compared that to the standard rate of Proclova, which is going to be a 1.5 pints per acre, to standard rates of Grazon Next, 2,4-D plus dicamba, or 2,4-D by itself, crossbow, and some other herbicides. And what we found was really, I think the take-home message here is it's pretty similar in terms of weed control spectrum to 2,4-D plus dicamba. Here on the screen, I'm showing horse nettle control. It wasn't as good as some of the other herbicides for horse nettle control. I think Grazon Next or Duracore are still going to be our go-to option there. So it's good on these herbaceous annual weeds, but the tougher to control perennial weeds is where you might have to reach back for one of those more hard-hitting herbicides like Grazon Next. The exception might be Canada thistle. It was actually surprisingly good on Canada thistle for us, basically kind of as good as Grazon Next, and maybe a little bit better in some cases than the 2,4-D plus dicamba. But I think for Canada thistle, regardless of what you apply, you're looking at multiple herbicide applications to completely control that weed. One of its strengths, and so I should mention, Proclova is basically a low rate of 2,4-D, puts about a half pound or a pint of 2,4-D out per acre plus fluoroperoxyfen benzyl. And one of the strengths of the fluoroperoxyfen benzyl is plantain and carrot control, like we mentioned for Duracore. So we looked at here broadleaf plantain control. This is probably a really good fit for Proclova, excellent control of broadleaf plantain. But again, where the selling point is the white clover response. And so we really controlled white clover pretty easily with Grazon Next and 2,4-D plus dicamba. Our quart of 2,4-D in this trial actually kept a lot of the clover around, but Proclova, we had a little bit of injury early on, and then we had a complete recovery of that by the end of this trial, somewhere between like 60 and 90 days after treatment. You won't be able to notice that you applied it on clover. So that's sort of been the holy grail of pasture herbicides for a while, is how can I control my weeds and keep my clover? And so when this hits the market, I think it'll be an option to do that. But I don't want to give the impression that it's entirely safe to clover. So here on the screen, if you can see it, I've got a picture of one of our trials that was a white clover monoculture. We planned to do this study in 24 hours after treatment. You do see that curling and twisting that you see with 2,4-D and other auxin type herbicides on the clover. And it pretty much kind of stays that way for 3-4 weeks, and somewhere between kind of 3 and 5 weeks, we see recovery, and it looks just like it does in the non-treated here. So you will get some clover injury. When it's a legume or a white clover monoculture, it's really easy to see. When it's mixed with grasses, you'd actually don't notice it quite as much, but you do get some injuries. So I think how Cooperative is marketing it as preserving white clover is really probably the right phrase to describe that. But it is an option with has meaningful weed control to keep our white clover. So it'll be interesting when that comes out. Do want to mention dry fertilizer impregnation. This is becoming more popular as more and more co-ops have got blenders to do this. And so what this is basically you put the herbicide on the fertilizer and then you spread the fertilizer across the pasture. And so there's some win-wins for everybody here. The co-op can cover more ground and kind of have a value-added product. They don't like putting spray rigs out in pastures a lot of times because it tends to beat those things up, but a fertilizer buggy's a little can take the punishment a little bit better. And then there's the savings to the farmer in terms of, you're not paying to apply the fertilizer and then paying again to apply the herbicide. It's just one application cost. So we've done a couple studies with this now. And I know some of the co-ops have done things on a lot of acres. I think some of them are doing 8,000 or 10,000 acres a year of this now. And it is, I think, a really viable means of doing this. So here we in this study, we had a couple rates of Duracore, 16 and 20 fluid ounces. If you're going to do this, I'd say go for the 20 fluid ounces of Duracore because you miss the foliar contact, or at least a lot of the foliar contact of the herbicide on the leaf material, right? Basically, it's going to go straight to the soil and it has to be root absorbed. And so by missing some of that exposure to the plant, we need to make up for that with a little bit higher rate. But so we had Duracore at a couple rates, Proclova at a couple rates, and then the Grazon Next Chaparral and a fertilizer only check. This one, we went out at 250 pounds of fertilizer per acre in total. You need a minimum of 200 because you got to get that coverage across the landscape to make this work. All right, so what did we see? I'll show a couple of results from 2 trials. This is one we did in Blacksburg. Most of the weeds the dominant weed species were common ragweed and plantain. And if you see the screen, what we have is blue bars are the grass yield, which is what we're trying to grow. And then the orange bars on top of that are the broadleaf weed control, or so the broadleaf biomass, right? So we want a tall blue bar and a little sliver or no orange at the top. And the controls all the way over there to the right. So in the control, we grew about 300 pounds of broadleaf weeds and about 1,100 pounds of grass. And pretty much any herbicide we put out that had aminopyrrolate in it, where that was Chaparral, Grazon Next, or Duracore, we had 85 to 90% control of those broadleaf weeds. And that increased the amount of grass we grew somewhere between 100 and 500 more pounds across 2 harvests during that year. What didn't really work was Proclova, right? Proclova has got 2,4-D and fluoroperoxabenzoyl. Those aren't persistent in the soil. And so we didn't get that weed control. So Cooperative is not really recommending Proclova for the dry fertilizer impregnation. It's really these aminopyrrolate containing herbicides. And they worked really well in this study. The other study I'll share, this was, we broke down the categories a little bit more. We had our forage grasses, weedy grasses, legumes, and then broadleaf weeds. And so if you can see the screen kind of compared to the check, we had Chaparral and Grazon Next in this study. The Chaparral actually grew a little bit more weedy grasses than the check, and that's because the metsulfuron in there injures fescue a little bit, and that kind of slowed the fescue competition down and allowed for some of those barnyard grass and annual grassy weeds to come in there. But with Grazon Next, we did grow significantly more forage grasses than the non-treated, somewhere about 1,500 pounds more of grass there over, I think this was 3 cuttings in that hayfield across the year, and grew significantly fewer broadleaf weeds. But, in both cases, we pretty much eliminated the legumes from these. So that's the dry fertilizer impregnation data we have. I think what I'm hearing from co-ops that have done this, they're real satisfied with it. It is good weed control when applied in the spring. I'm not aware of data of it applied in the fall, and so that's something we need to look at in future research. But it does basically result in some good season-long weed control of our summer annual broadleaf weeds. But to make it work, you really need to have you have a need for both the weed control and the fertilizer at the same time. If you just need one or the other, then maybe this isn't the best fit. But it's a good technique, and it's working pretty well for a lot of acres out there. All right, the last thing I'm gonna before I open up for questions, I thought I would put up this table out of our pest management guide. It's the optimum time of year for foliar application of herbicides to various weeds. And so when you look at right across the top row is our winter annual weeds. And so we're coming up, as I mentioned, on a great time in the fall to look at controlling those weeds. Another opportunity in the spring. There's also, we're kind of ending the opportunity for some of these weeds right now for like hemp dogbane and milkweed to get a good dose of herbicide on those right now and get that down into the roots before the winter. But there's some opportunities right now, and this is a table that really kind of helps you kind of parse out, what time of year it is and what weeds might be ones to go after. Yeah, I'll open up for questions if there are any at this point.
Michael, thank you so much. At this point, everyone, if you have a question you would like to ask Dr. Flessner, you have the option to unmute yourself with the little microphone down in the left-hand corner, or if you would rather type your question in the chat box, we can cover it that way.
There's not any questions. I know Nimblewill is a weed that comes on kind of early in the summer, but it kind of shows up this time of year. And I don't have any good options for it. I'm just curious if that's something you're seeing and out in your area as a problem coming into our cool season pastures and forages. I think over here in my end of the state, we're getting more and more of it. And so we're going to be looking at ways to try to control it, but I'm not sure as central and eastern Virginia if it's out there as much. Maybe not then.
Like we got a question in the chat box down here. Talk a little bit about hemp dogbane control. The northern Piedmont has lots of it.
Yeah, hemp dogbane is one that seems to be getting worse and worse every year for us, and it's also one of our really toughest to control weeds. It's got a really solid underground structure that stores a lot of energy down there, and so once it's established, it's really tough to get enough herbicide down there to kill those budding roots, and so it kind of forms these colonies, and so you'll see a patch of it, and every year that patch seems to just get a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger. To control it, I really like Surmount is the best product, and that's a restricted use pesticide, so it might be hard to find, but kind of 2 to 3 pints of that is really the best herbicide for it. If you can't get a hold of that or don't have a pesticide applicator's license to do that, the next best thing is really crossbow at a higher rate as you can afford, up to 4 quarts or a gallon per acre. Or if you can spot spray those areas, that'll help too. But it's really a weed that we're going to probably have to treat at least twice sequentially to get control of. So its ideal timing is usually kind of late July and August. It kind of depends on if it seems like it's in more, well, it's probably in pastures and hay fields, but if you've mowed hay or cut hay, you kind of set that growth stage back a little bit. But that early bud stage just before flowering is really a good time. Or right now when it's when the fall, when these cooler nights, it's going to start sending the photosynthase and the energy down towards the roots, and you can kind of hitch a ride with that with the herbicide and get more translocation down to the roots. But it's really a weed that we're going to have to treat a couple times before we get complete control over it. Seen some other questions in there. How do we eradicate horse nettle? So horse nettle is probably one of our most ubiquitous pasture weeds. That's one where I really like Graze On Next and Duracore on it. The optimal time for that, it's actually kind of one of the exceptions to our rules on perennial weeds, but applied at full flowering is the best time. And usually that's kind of mid-July, maybe late July. So we're a little bit late this time of year to treat it. It's probably got berries on it. It's probably not growing too much anymore. But that's another weed that, I'm not sure if eradication is really possible with it. It's just so hard to control because it's got these underground rhizomes and it can be an extremely deep rooted plant as well, maybe 10 feet deep in the ground or more. And so, one field might actually be just one plant because they're all interconnected with these rhizomes, or it might be a bunch of little plants. It's always been kind of a challenge to know that without digging up a whole pasture. But the Graze On Next, treating it a couple times should really knock it back substantially there. But it's one that's really tough to control. Pretty much any weed, if you spot treat it, you're going to get a higher dose of herbicide compared to a broadcast application. And so that's a way to get better control if it's spot treatable. But usually horse nettle is so widespread that that's pretty tough to do. Let's see. So generally, what is your goal? 100% grass, mix of legume grass. Can you speak about species diversity, like chicory, plantain, sericea, lespedeza? We raise meat goats and we want the sericea. Yeah, so it's always a good question. In terms of what is a weed is a harder question to answer sometimes in a pasture than it is in any of our other crops that we grow. If the animals are eating it, and they're doing well, gaining weight, making milk, whatever the purpose of that animal is, then, I wouldn't call it a weed. So things like chicory and plantain and Sericea lespedeza for goats, even blackberries and brambles, goats seem to love them and they do well on them. So, it really kind of depends on what animals you have on the pasture in terms of what feed stuff that they're going to want to have. I do think a lot of times we have this trade-off, and where Proclova is going to provide a option for us. Not we can't let the pasture get away. Hemp Dogbane and milkweed and horse nettle and briars come in there, and then try to come in with Proclova to keep our clover. It's just not going to be that kind of herbicide. That's where we're going to have to get rid of the clover and treat it with a Graze On Next or Duracore. But if we can manage the pasture better and get on those weeds before we get to that successional state, that's going to be a tool for us. But if we've got a pasture that's just, a lot of weeds, problematic weeds, tough to control weeds, that's where I don't think it's really worthwhile to keep the legume out there, because we know if we get rid of those weeds, we're going to grow so much more grass. And there's been several studies that have looked at animal performance and what the return on investment that is. And a lot of those, if it's really weedy, it points to get rid of the clovers. It's better to grow more grass in those situations. But if it's not really weedy, we know that legumes have a lot of benefits for the pasture and a valuable part of the forage. And so it's a really tough question of what is the goal there. But with our management options, I think there's ways to kind of parse that. But yeah, for goats and wanting to keep lespedeza and things like that around, which usually isn't a problem, I think that kind of defines your goal there. Kenner asks, what are recommended herbicides for stiltgrass control in pastures? So we've had a couple grassy weeds that we've been able to get control over with some various treatments. One of those is stiltgrass or Japanese stiltgrass, sometimes called microstegium. We've seen good control, not great control of stiltgrass with aminopyrrolid containing herbicides. So chaparral, graze on next. We haven't looked at Duracore, but Duracore might have a little bit better control of stiltgrass because on Flora Oxymetal does have on the rice label some warm season annual grasses on it, which Japanese stiltgrass is a warm season annual, but it's not listed on that label. But the rice label puts out a lot more of that herbicide than the Duracore puts on. So we haven't looked at that one, but that might be a little bit better. But the immunoperilla containing herbicides are giving us about 75% control of stiltgrass when they're applied about the June timing. So sort of shortly after emergence, kind of 3 to 6 inches tall. It's tough to, I think, justify that, because it's not complete control. Usually stiltgrass is in the shaded area around like the edge or along the forest line of a pasture. And so it's not out in the middle of the pasture. And so it's an area where the fescue and orchard grass aren't doing as well anyway. But if there's broadleaf weeds there, then that can kind of drive the economics, right? Because we can suppress the stiltgrass and get some broadleaf weed control. But if it's just the stiltgrass, it's kind of questionable whether that's worthwhile or not in those areas. Prowl, in theory, it's our only pre-emergent option labeled in cool season grasses. And in theory, it should be controlling stiltgrass, but stiltgrass can germinate really early in the year. And we just haven't had a whole lot of success with it. Now, there are some co-ops I've heard have had success with it. I think maybe our trials, we were just too far into the forest and we were getting some of that leaf litter duff that tied up the prowl and wasn't available for herbicidal control. Yeah, but in theory, prowl should work, 2 to 3 pints per acre, but you have to apply it like early, so even before crabgrass. So you're probably looking at like a mid-March to early March application to make that work. So the other weed that prowl has worked really well on it and is becoming more problematic in our pastures is joint head arthraxin. And so a pre-emergent application of that, it comes up a little later, so it's easier to get the prowl out there ahead of time to control that weed. And that's one that's worked really well for joint head arthraxin. I think that's all the questions I see in the chat. Are there any others?
Give it a few moments here and see if anybody else has anything they'd like to ask. Okay, well, not seeing any other questions in the chat and not hearing any comments from the audience, we would like to thank Dr. Flessner for joining us today. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Flessner. A lot of great information that you shared. We'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today, as well as in all of our previous sessions. We appreciate you being here. Finally, I'd like to thank our VCE AG Today team, Robbie Longest, Laura Maxine, Stephanie Romelchek, and Frank Long. They're the agents that put this together, plan these sessions, set up the speakers. I will remind everybody before we go that these recordings are available on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to go back and rewatch today's session or any of the previous sessions that we've held, all of those recordings are available there. And then finally, before we go, I'd like to encourage everybody, if you would, to please consider taking our brief survey. I think, Stephanie, you can see it on the screen here. You can scan that QR code. It'll take you directly to it. Or Stephanie has placed the link in the chat box as well. Encourage you to take that. We get all of our ideas for these programs from the survey results that you send in. We want to make sure that we're addressing the needs of our audience. We want to make sure that these programs that we're holding are informative in what y'all need to see. So if you would, please consider taking that survey here this morning before you head out. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody again for being here today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. I wish you a great rest of your Thursday.
Hey, Dr. Flessner.
Yes, sir.
can you send that Kevin Bradley data to the listserv? I
Yeah.
think that would be interesting reading that.
Okay. Yeah.
That would work in a lot of different scenarios with for programming stuff. So
Okay. Yeah, and I'll attach the full peer-reviewed pub to that too, if you really want to have some light reading.
okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks all. See you.
Bye.